So I'm Jamie, the Adult Program Coordinator at the library, and I'm here to welcome William Swislow, Outsider Art Authority and board member of Intuit, the Center of Intuitive and Outsider Art. William Swislow has documented thousands of revetment carvings. Tonight, he'll show examples of this underfoot, tell its story, and discuss the carvers who made them. So
thank you, everyone, for signing in, and those of you who braved the cold, damp weather outside to, hopefully I will brighten up your day with talking about our great Lake Michigan and an unusual part of Lake Michigan, which I call a virtual museum that hardly anyone knows about. So to start with, I should say that much of the lakefront in Chicago is lined with these limestone blocks, which you can see here, that were put in place about 100 years ago, or starting about 100 years ago, to protect the shoreline from the water. So this is Promontory Point in Hyde Park. These are called revetments, the technical term. And this is a place where millions of people over, since for those 100 years have strolled and hung out. But they were also this canvas on which ordinary people, nearly all of them unknown, left traces of their identity. And if you look at this, you can see there's like Mike on top and Chris on the bottom, and probably 24 names carved into this rock. This is also in Hyde Park. And to me, it's an art gallery because these people, without necessarily knowing it, were making art. But it's also what I call a spontaneous social history of the millions of people who have spent time on the lakefront. So these are ordinary people leaving behind really a collective monument to the good times that they had on the lake. Now, carvings in rocks are not unusual, are not totally unheard of. Every once in a while, if you're in the woods, you might come across a group of graffiti carvings. These may be hard to see for the folks in the room, live in the room, but it's a long bunch of names. This is a Giant City State Park in Southern Illinois, and people started carving their names here. I mean, the earliest date, I think, is 1840, and left their names. Now, this isn't really appropriate in a natural setting for people to do that. Of course, there's also indigenous petroglyphs like these, which are in Hawaii, that you might have seen or read about. There's a lot in the American Southwest as well. But the difference is that like these petroglyphs are centuries old, whereas the carvings we're talking about here in Chicago have been made basically since about the late 1920s, 1930 at the latest. And that makes them different because they're modern. So in this rock, for example, this rock, there's a date on the lower right-hand corner, 1961. This rock has about 40 names carved into it. This is at Foster Avenue Beach in Chicago. All these are in Chicago. So you have Otto and Doc and all these different people creating this sort of collective work of art. We don't know what they intended, which is actually true of most petroglyphs as well, ancient petroglyphs. We don't know why exactly they decided to make these carvings. But we know that they were hanging out and they felt like doing something, I guess. So the petroglyphs in Chicago stretch all the way from the Indiana state line, which is at the bottom here, Calumet Park Beach, all the way up basically to Hollywood Avenue. It's about 22 miles and a few more further north at Loyola Park Beach. These are rocks at Rainbow Beach on the south side, which we'll talk about more. If you can see this closely, each of these locations, there are little numbers, which aren't the exact count of carvings, but they give a sense of how many we're talking about. So at Calumet Park Beach, just north of Indiana, I believe there's 358 carvings that I've been able to count, at least. That's like the minimum number. So there are hundreds and hundreds of carvings, and all told, I've counted about 2,500 kind of what I call unique photos of carvings, but some of those photos might have 2, 3, 4, or like that rock we just saw, 40 carvings. So there are literally thousands of carvings that still exist on the Chicago lakefront. But what this virtual museum is virtually unknown. I can't tell you how many times I've been out taking pictures of carvings, and people have asked me what I was doing, and I said, well, there's these interesting rock carvings, and people will say, I come here all the time and I've never noticed them. which is interesting, but they really have gotten almost no attention. They got some attention in the early 1990s when my partner in the book you see on the table, if you're in the room, Aaron Packer, was photographing them and had an exhibit at the Chicago Cultural Center of his photographs of the rock carvings. And there was a little bit of attention at the time. But that's about it, with a couple of exceptions, one of which I'll talk about. You won't find anything written about these when you read histories of the Chicago Park District, the Chicago Lakefront. It's totally silent in the media, basically silence about this. And like I say, one reason is that although art can be found anywhere, which is one of the main themes of the night, is art shows up not just at institutions, not just in places that are showing art with a capital A or are sanctioned, but it can be found anywhere. Like this is an example, this delicate mermaid, which is on the edge of Foster Beach in Chicago. All these are in Chicago. You can kind of see her tail on the lower left, and she's sort of sitting back, but it can be hard to see. And this is a shot from another angle, and if you're just walking by, you wouldn't see the mermaid, even though she's right there at the bottom of the picture. And so I think it's not a total shock that people haven't noticed these. I always say that, people who are at the lake are usually looking out at the lake or looking at their friends, or, they're not looking down at the rocks. But if you do look around, you'll start seeing interesting things like, we're still at Foster Beach, so there's an Abraham Lincoln carving in the rocks, in this rock overlooking at the Foster Beach from the north end. You might see a foot. This is at Rainbow Beach on the south side, carved into the rock. You might see a hand. This hand is at Foster Beach, and it's about 3 feet tall. It's a very large hand. Or you might see a lion. You can see the lion there at the bottom of the photo, also Foster Beach. I love this lion because on the left-hand side of this picture, the lion is carved, but it ended like right toward the middle, and then someone later on painted a body for the lion, gave this poor lion a body and a tail. And I really love, from a sort of an art interest point of view, that the body has a very much a Jackson Pollock effect. It's like this drip painting almost. But I love the fact that someone gave usually you don't like it when people paint over these carvings. It's sort of I see it as vandalism, but in this case, they enhanced the carving. Anyways, you could see a face or two. This mask is very interesting. And it actually, this is a rendering of basically the logo that was created for Thor Heyerdahl's Kon-Tiki expedition. And if you looked up that logo, this looks very much like it. So they were undoubtedly inspired by that. Another face, I call this John Malkovich, although who knows? Both of these are near Montrose Beach. You'll see a lot of names of those thousands of carvings. Maybe at least half of them are names. So there's Bill Adler. This is in Hyde Park on the south side, but really nicely carved, nice typography. And you'll see a lot of hearts. Obviously, a lot of couples, people, tributes to their lovers. This heart has a little arrow through it, which is very nice. That's on the south side as well. These are both on the south side of the city. And then you'll see carvings that are meaningful, but not clear what they mean. So we call this the triptych. This is at Foster Beach. On the left, you can see a television set with Nixon carved underneath it, and then the weird dollar sign. In the middle, this is in some ways disturbing because you got the 3 crosses of Calvary, and then probably carved by someone not the carver of the crucifixion scene, dead haha. So there's a little bit of tension there. And then this very naturalistic fish, all carved on one rock. And this rock, like most of these rocks, is probably about 8 feet wide, and maybe 3 feet deep. This is facing upward. So, what exactly was the intention and the meaning, particularly on the Nixon thing, who knows? A lot of these carvings I just showed are at the north end of Foster Beach, where there are 20 of these big limestone blocks, and there are more than 30 carvings just on those 20 blocks at the north end of the beach. You can see the hand there is right there, and several of the other carvings were nearby. And they cluster. A lot of these carvings cluster because the carvings are, to some extent, are about where people hung out. If people were hanging out, that's where they were sitting around, and they were, digging into the rocks. sometimes with hammers and chisels, sometimes probably with like a sharpened nail, or in some cases even keys. The more elaborate carvings, they must have used hammers and chisels. And I'll talk about the one time I saw a carver at work in a little while. So at that north end of Foster Beach, there's this cluster of carvings. That hand, as I say, is like 3 feet tall. This bathing beauty is one of my favorite of all the carvings, is about 4 inches tall. Very small, very delicate, but just a, there's, Summer by Lake Michigan is, this woman holding her, feet sitting down. There's this sort of random image of a pirate. There's this plaque, which, is, no one made any money or got famous carving it, but it's very complex. And it's kind of hard to read. And it's an example of all these are eroding, all these are fading over time because they're all exposed to the weather. But in the upper left of this plaque, this is at Foster Beach as well, there are 2 fish. In the upper right, it's very hard to see, but I'm pretty sure it's a torso, this being the beach. The lower right is a squirrel, this being Lincoln Park. There's an unlimited supply of squirrels. And then the date, 1958, which is the year that Foster Beach officially opened. It was built as part of the extension of Lakeshore Drive in the late 1950s. But the really special thing about Foster Beach is what comes next. So some of you may recognize this song from the video. So the big hit from Grease, or one of the 2 big hits. So Summer Nights was written by this guy, Jim Jacobs. This is a picture of Jim Jacobs at Foster Beach in 1960. He is so cool. And he's not that cool anymore. I've seen contemporary photos of him. But he, as you may know, Grease was originally written about Chicago teenagers who went to Taft High School. And in the original version of Grease, there was a song called Foster Beach that became Summer Nights. But when they moved Grease to Broadway, they dropped all the Chicago references, including Foster Beach. And they rewrote the Foster Avenue Beach song. And it's actually they improved it to become Summer Nights. But if you ever, you can hear it online. There's a YouTube with the original Foster Beach song, and you can tell that was the source. But what I love about the song Foster Avenue Beach was this lyric. He painted on the rocks a summer souvenir on Foster Beach. If you walk by the water, you can see a big red heart with 2 names inside. One is his and the other's mine. Now, at Foster Beach, there is a carved heart, Pat and Jim Jacobs being the writer of Grease. It's purely my wishful thinking to think that that's what this line alludes to. Don't know, have no idea. I've tried to get in contact with Jim Jacobs, but not successfully so far. Maybe someday I'll be able to ask him. But as I say, there are a lot of these hearts, a lot of couples whose relationships are immortalized along the lake. An example is here, which is a little hard to read, but it says Kathy and Buzz. So this is from Rainbow Beach on the south side. Rainbow Beach is about 77th Street on the south side. So Kathy and Buzz. Well, Buzz is Buzz Zingaro. And because Buzz Zingaro's name is a little unusual, I was able to track him down through the Goshen, New York Rotary Club, where Buzz had been active. And Buzz was great, because one of the things he explained to me was, it's hard to see on this photo, but it says Buzz Zingaro, and then underneath it says 1963-4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So Buzz was a lifeguard at Rainbow Beach. And those are the years that he worked as a lifeguard when he was going to Leo High School. He went on to be a teacher, but he told me that the lifeguards had a hammer and chisel they would pass around, and they would all carve their names when they had downtime. It was just a way to pass the time. And indeed, at Rainbow Beach, there are lots of these names with the years and the hyphens underneath them. But what's really great about Buzz is that Kathy and Buzz is on the lower left-hand side of this bigger rock with Spike and a bunch of other names on it. But when I was interviewing Buzz, he said, well, and Kathy's in the room across from me. So they are still together, Kathy and Buzz, which is a good thing, because they're immortalized there at Rainbow Beach forever. A similar story is this one. So Bob Nacktree, another unusual name, who had been involved in some historic preservation issues in Joliet, and that's how I tracked him down. And Bob told me that, he and his friend Cliff Weaver were U of C freshmen in 1964, and early one morning, they just needed to get away. And so they decided they would go to Promontory Point, which is across from the Museum of Science and Industry there, and they carved their names and their girlfriends' names into the rock. So that's Linda Turner, Bob Nachtrieb, 64. The hammers and chisels belonged to Bob's father. They went out early in the morning because, according to Cliff, Bob was so embarrassed by what they were doing, he didn't want anyone to see them doing it. They were stopped by a cop who asked what they were doing, and they told them, and the cop let them go. So, so that's Bob Nachtrieb, and here's his friend Clifford Weaver, Donna Florence, 1964. Clifford Weaver became a very prominent zoning attorney in Chicago, and of course, good news is that Donna and Cliff and Bob and Linda are all still together as well. So there's something great about carving your name into the rocks along the Chicago lakefront. Love that. So another Rainbow Beach lifeguard was a guy named Rick Bertetto. So he started when he was probably about 14, and he worked at Rainbow Beach the summers of 1957 through 1962. What I love about Rick Bertetto is he was in the class of 1961 at Chicago Vocational High School. This is the page from their yearbook with their championship football team. And why was it championship football team? Because Rick Bertetto is third from the left, but across the gutter from Rick Bertetto is Rich Butkus. So thus the championship football team. And based on later articles I found, Rick Bertetto and Dick Butkus remained friends over the years. So Rick not only was on the football team, but he was on the basketball team. He was a lunchroom monitor, and he was a lifeguard at Rainbow Beach, which was about 10 miles, a 10-minute drive away from his high school. So that's Rick Bertetto. And it would have been great to have found a Dick Butkus carving, but I don't know that Dick was ever a lifeguard. One more Rainbow Beach character I was able to track down is a guy named Guy Lazzara. Guy carved this. He was a steel worker at Southworks, which is a little bit south of Rainbow Beach, and he said he just wanted to get away. He went to Rainbow Beach to get away, and he just thought, maybe I'll try carving something in the rocks there. He was not an artist. He never became an artist, but he carved his name. That's his birthday, 4/30/38. And then on the left, he carved a self-portrait. Unfortunately, he told me it was vandalized not long after he carved it, and you can kind of see it's rough. But you could see before it was vandalized, it was a pretty delicate self-portrait carved by someone who had never carved anything before, never really made much art, but he made the self-portrait, and it's still there. As are these, which I just show because it's just, I just find this charming carving. You have sort of the wacky, almost clown face head on the right, on the left, and then right next to it is this little skull, which is probably about 4 inches tall, that's carved into the rock there. And in fact, when I took all these pictures, I didn't even notice the skull. It was only when I was looking at the photo of the character on the left that I saw there's a skull right next to it. So that's Rainbow Beach. Now, I said that, as I think I alluded to, almost all these carvings are by people who are unknown. The guys I was just talking about are the exceptions. Because most of the time, even when there's a name carved, it's not a name that means anything. So, it's like Al Green. And it's not the Al Green, it's just some Al Green. There's no way to find Al Green. And that's another reason why, these are relatively unknown, is that, people kind of left their names and that's it. They forgot about it and no one really followed up. There's one exception to that, and to this general principle that no one has written about or covered these, and that's the creator of this mermaid. The mermaid today sits south of Oakwood Beach, so this is at about 44th or 45th Street in the lake. But this mermaid was originally carved right on the lake at 39th Street by a carver named Roman Villarreal and 3 of his friends, one of whom was a stone carver from Mexico. Roman himself is a self-taught stone carver who actually is fairly prominent artist on the South Side today. He has carvings in a number of Chicago parks, but the mermaid is in my opinion his masterpiece. So in 1986 he wanted to do something with his friend from the stone carver from Mexico, and he knew that there was all this limestone along the lake, so they went out and they carved this mermaid. But for years no one knew who made it. And it's fairly, it's large, right? It's one of those big blocks. There's a close-up on it. So in 2000, the Sun-Times wrote a story about the mystery mermaid, and they talked about how no one could explain to them where it came from. They said they looked at the archives at the Park District and they got no explanation. So they did the story on the left, mystery mermaid, and that it wasn't going to be destroyed along with all the other carvings, that someone at the Park District, bless them, decided they were going to save it. Well, Roman's daughter was the model for the mermaid. She saw the story in the Sun-Times, and so she went to the Sun-Times and explained, well, it was my father who made the mermaid. And so a couple days later, very quickly, they did the story on who actually carved the mermaid, and it's Roman Villarreal. There he is in his studio, which is pretty much under the Chicago Skyway on the far south side with some of his stone carvings. As I say, he's prolific. He paints, he sculpts, he carves. And for what it's worth, at my museum Intuit, we're actually doing a retrospective on Roman that's opening in June. I mean, the reason is because I found him for the carving stuff and then brought him to Intuit and said, this guy's really interesting. We should show more of his art. And so we're going to do that. Things do happen. You may notice those. There's the mermaid. Probably I took that picture 3 years ago. This is the mermaid now. It's lying on its side. Which I scratched my head about, well, why would someone do that? But according to Roman, this Park District said, it was the function of ice and the lake action, even though it's not right on the lake. I mean, you can see it's sort of separated, but that's how powerful the lake can be and ice flows can be, that the ice basically tipped this thing over. It actually doesn't look that bad tipped over. It tipped over on the side that doesn't have any art on it. So it was just as well. Maybe the ice will come back the other way and tip it the other way. So Roman and his main partner Roman's Mexican-American. Roman, by the way, is a former steel worker. Before he became a professional stone carver or artist, he worked in the steel mills until they laid everyone off. Around Foster Beach, the largest group of carvings that I've been able to identify by the same person also have a Mexican heritage. So this is an example of one of them. The same person made 12 carvings around Foster Avenue Beach. They're very intricate. Some of them are so intricate it's even hard to figure out what's going on in them. They were made in the mid-1990s. I know that because I saw him at work. Unfortunately, in the mid-1990s, I didn't have the presence of mind to talk to him or ask him, anything about why he was doing it. I just sort of watched him for a minute. He was a Hispanic middle-aged man using hand tools, making these carvings. What I found out only recently was, obviously this carving, you can see the skull. It has that sort of Mesoamerican Mayan look. But what I learned recently, because a neighbor pointed this out to me, is in fact his carvings, at least several of them that we've been able to identify, were based on actual carvings on Mayan ruins. So this is from the Great Ball Court at Chichen Itza. His is a little bit simplified, but obviously he was working probably from a picture of that. Here's another example, and this shows on the one hand how difficult it is to you really have to look at these carvings that he made, some of them, to figure out what's even going on. But this is actually a bird deity. It's a detail from the tablet of the foliated cross at Palenque in Mexico, another Mayan ruin. I will say that on the sort of lower right of that inner frame, that's a hummingbird, which is, I guess, a popular theme in Mayan carvings. This carving, unfortunately, he didn't have room to, just a second, I somehow lost the thing. There we go. He didn't, give me 1 second, I have to hide the controls. I don't know why they showed up. Anyways, you can see that what he carved was the very top of a much more massive carving, but unfortunately on Lake Michigan, there isn't that much space to do that. So he only did a highlight. And then one more example. Yeah, I'm technical. There we go. This carving is about 9 feet wide, actually 9 feet wide. These are all on Foster Avenue Beach. And you can see if you look in the center, there's a face, and then it's like a giant headdress. And this is another one that you can see on the bottom of this drawing, which is also from the Great Ball Court at Chichen Itza. So this carver was remarkable. he did all these carvings, and some of them are dated from in 1995, 1996, and then disappeared. Now, someone did notice about 20 years ago, I got an email from Jeffrey Bayer at Channel 11 asking me about, do I know anything about these? And unfortunately, I had to tell him, no, I didn't really know anything about them. I hadn't done any research at the time. I've tried to contact Jeffrey more recently, but with no response to see if he was still interested 20 years later. I could give him a better answer, but so it goes. Anyways, those are these Mayan religious symbols, but there are lots of symbols carved up and down the lakefront, and just a few of them, male-female symbols. This is at Morgan Shoal in Hyde Park, which we'll talk about more. A Maltese cross. This is behind La Rabida Hospital, which is about 65th Street and the lake. There's a whole, we'll see more from there. In fact, this is one of my favorite of all the rocks that I found on the lake. This is also behind La Rabida Hospital. I mean, this one I love because, so you have the peace symbol carved in the middle. Next to it, you have the peace sign. There are flowers up above it. There are butterflies on the left. It says peace, and then you can't really see it well in this picture, but on the far left, there's a bare foot. So I like to call this the entire summer of love in one rock. Also behind La Rabida Hospital on the south side. And then this nice peace sign, which is at Fullerton Avenue near a theater on the lake. I will say, having really tried to look carefully at this, there are far more peace signs than there are swastikas. There's 3 or 4 swastikas I found, but I found a lot more peace signs. So I guess that's to the credit of the people in Chicago. So at Fullerton Avenue, there's a whole bunch of interesting symbols. So you have these Egyptian symbols, another rock with Egyptian theme. There's a little pyramid in the middle. And these are relatively recent carvings. One of these is dated 2005. A couple Easter Island, actually there's one in the middle. These are all at Fullerton Avenue in the lake. And then this one, which we call the hair washers. This one is considerably older. It has that sort of Laredo Taft, early 20th century look, but never been able to find a source for it, and again, don't know who the carving was. Now, the reason these are there is because in 2016, the city expanded Lincoln Park and actually did landfill next to the theater on the lake building, if you're familiar with that building at Fullerton Avenue, and they added a little bit of acreage to Lincoln Park. And the landscape architect on that project noticed the carvings and asked them to save as many of them as they could. A lot of them, she said, were destroyed in the process of moving them, but the ones that were saved, she repurposed. So the hair washers, if you look on you can't really, it's hard to see from the room, but on the lower left there is the carving with the hair washers. That peace sign is off screen to the right. I like this picture because this is what makes the lakefront so beautiful, right? It really captures it. So these were saved, and among the few that were saved, when most of the carvings in this area were lost, which I'll talk about in a minute. But the other thing to keep in mind, and this gets to a little bit of the context behind the whole phenomenon I'm talking about, is that the reason these carvings exist is because of what I would call Chicago's greatest cultural achievement, which is the preservation of the lakefront as an area that is free from industrial and commercial use and available for people to get to. In so many cities around in the U.S., certainly, and around the world, their waterfronts were developed for industrial use. They're piers and railroads and highways and warehouses and commercial harbors. And that didn't happen in Chicago. Now, it didn't happen for a reason. If you're familiar with the history of Chicago and the lakefront, you may have seen a version of this map. And this is a map of Michigan Avenue, sort of right in the loop. It was drawn around 1836 when the state sent commissioners to Chicago to kind of define what the city would be. And you can see it says, public ground, a common to remain forever open, clear, and free of any buildings or other obstructions, whatever. So both state and federal officials in the mid-19th century declared the lakefront off limits to construction. Now, if you're familiar with politics anywhere, but certainly in Chicago, that wasn't sufficient to keep the lakefront free and clear. And up until the present day, there's been constant wrangling and fighting and litigation over whether there can be construction on the lakefront. Now, the most famous example of that is Montgomery Ward, who basically invented catalog retailing, had his offices on Michigan Avenue overlooking the lake. And for years, he was incredibly litigious, fighting almost every attempt to build anything in Grant Park. The exception was the Art Institute, but he made them, originally the Field Museum was going to be built next to the Art Institute. He forced them to build it off of Grant Park in new landfill that was basically owned by the Illinois Central Railroad, part of a grand bargain. But there was lots of other litigation. In fact, there's a fascinating book that came out last year by a couple of lawyers about the history, the legal history of Chicago lakefront, which may seem very dry, but it's really a wonderful book. I mean, it talks about like the famous Captain Streeter, the squatter that Streeterville is named after, and just all of the wrangling and battles that that have taken place over the years to preserve this principle of a lakefront free and clear of buildings, which largely is what happened. There are a few exceptions, McCormick Place being one of them, Soldier Field, for a while Meigs Field. But for the most part, this view has prevailed, and that's why we have access, and that's why people are able to make the carvings, is because they could actually get to the lakefront to hang out and do that. Now, the other thing, though, is about the Chicago lakefront is that it's constantly being taken back by the lake, because the Chicago lakefront is essentially artificial, almost the entire length of it. If it's not, most of it is landfill, and what's not landfill is still highly engineered. And I just like to say the lake doesn't like that. So if you look back, and this is from 1901, you know, the lake destroying parts of Lincoln Park. 1917, the lake destroying part of the lakefront. 1929, the lake destroying part of the lakefront. This is around when they came up with this idea of a different way to protect the lakefront, which is putting in these large limestone blocks, which were quarried in Indiana, as I understand it. I mean, the best history says they came from Indiana. And I'm told by someone who's done research in this that they came from the same quarries that were providing limestone for buildings like the Empire State Building. The ones we got were the rejects that had flaws that made them not appropriate for architectural use. And so they must have gotten them for a bargain. So starting in the late 1920s, probably maybe as early as 1925, they started lining the lakefront with these big blocks to protect it. And this is just an example that the same story today. You may recall just a couple of years ago, between the high waves and the storms, lakefront was again in the news. So this is at around Waveland Avenue, these rocks being put in place, probably in the early 1930s, maybe the late 1920s. This is another view of Promontory Point, which is landfill jutting out of the lake, and this is Promontory Point under construction. And you can see there are these like construction cranes all around it, which were lowering these blocks into place at Promontory Point, which we'll talk a little more about Promontory Point shortly. This is from 1936. Now, construction continues, and this is where we got, for me, what is the sad part. So this is construction site around Diversey Harbor in the early 2000s. So talked about all the damage to the lakefront. Well, so in the 1980s, the Army Corps of Engineers started studying what to do to preserve the lakefront, because what the Army Corps of Engineers cares about almost exclusively when it comes to this kind of shoreline is flooding and erosion. And that's really all they care about. So they studied it and studied it. They came up with a plan, and the city said no way, because the Army Corps original plan was they were going to line the lakefront with what is called a rubble mound revetment, which is just you pile up a lot of huge boulders along the lake, and it protects the shoreline, and it does, and it's the cheapest way to do it. And the city said, you can't do that for our entire shoreline. And the city actually came up with money for the alternative was to use concrete and steel, which is what they're installing here. So this stretch of the lakefront is between Diversey Avenue and Belmont Harbor, and this was known as the Rocks. In the gay community, this was a hugely popular hangout in the 1980s into the 1990s. And then in the 2000s, the Army Corps came and they started replacing the rocks that you see here with concrete. Now, it happens at this area of the rocks, they had already seen what the Army Corps was doing north of Belmont Harbor, putting in this concrete and steel revetment. And they said, we love our, people in the community said, we love our rocks. I mean, it was atmospheric, it was pleasant, and a lot of these rocks, as you'll see in a minute, had art on them as well. But it was too late, and the Army, after some resistance, the Army Corps tore up the rocks there, put in concrete and steel. As opponents of this will say, it's very sterile looking, and I can say it's also already deteriorating. There are already sections of concrete that have been ripped out by the lake. Now you will notice on the left there's a strip of the old limestone blocks. And that's because Tom Tunney, the alderman, who's still alderman, went out there with a project manager and a friend and identified rocks that he wanted them to save because of the artwork that was on the rocks. This was not written about at the time. I only know about it because someone posted to a Facebook group devoted to the Belmont Rocks her memory of doing this with Tom Tunney. So they saved a couple hundred of the old limestone rocks out of the thousands that were there just on this stretch. And some of these rocks have wonderful carvings on them, like this one. This is still there. You can still see this today. O solo mio, drink to me only with thine eyes. There's a flag, and there's this, very nice skull and crossbones carved into it. I think Tom Tunney and a lot of the people were more interested in what you can kind of see here, which is these rocks had writing and paintings all up and down them. So on the left, you can see some dense text. That's a extract of Walt Whitman poetry. So there's poetry, there were lyrics, there were all kinds of slogans and things written onto these rocks. And some of them, the art had these. Some of it was abstract, like this one, this sort of spiral. A lot of it had social content, like the one on the upper left has a syringe on it and unity. And some of these were saved, not that one, not the two on the left. I think the one on the right was saved by Tom Tunney. And you can walk along the rocks there, and you won't see the gay community there anymore, but you will see a few of these carvings and paintings. Mostly I'm talking about carvings, but there are lots of paintings on the lakefront as well. The problem is paintings don't last. So this was painted in 1999 near Hollywood Beach in Chicago, and it's a tribute to dead rock guitarists. So you can't really tell from here, but it's Muddy Waters, Howlin' Wolf, Jimi Hendrix, Frank Zappa, and Randy Rhoads, who was in Twisted Sister. So dead rock guitarist, an artist named Adam Rotter, painted this in 1999, but these paintings fade, so he came back in 2016 and restored it. So this was photographed after he restored it in 2016, but there's Muddy Waters already fading away again just a couple of years later. But Adam was out there last summer restoring it again. He didn't finish those, so you can see Howlin' Wolf and Jimi Hendrix, their faces need a little bit of work, but he also added B.B. King while he was there this summer. So this one should come back. Another artist, for what it's worth, who was active this summer, there was a guy named Tyler Anthony, who would come out to Foster Beach and do these chalk drawings of moon faces, which you see on the left, and then they would wash away with the next rain. And he did that a number of times. I told him, you should paint something. And I don't know if it was because I told him, but he did paint something. He painted another moon face, but this is actually paint that didn't wash away. Unfortunately, what I called the brown paint person from probably the Park District who was covering up graffiti also decided to cover up Tyler's painting and covered up some other paintings that had nothing to do with gang activity or graffiti, traditional graffiti, unfortunately. So I said, these go back a long time. This is the oldest dated carving I found, June 1930. This is at Morgan Shoal in Hyde Park. This is also at Morgan Shoal, which is, like I say, like 45th to 49th Street. It says June 2nd, 1931, Morgan Shoal. So here's just a few things from Morgan Shoal. This is a seated bathing beauty. This is one of my favorite carvings. This was obviously a much more recent carving, very good shape of sort of a Puritan winged skull, but frank underneath it. But as an example of how these are exposed, not just to the predations of government, but of the lake itself. So that's Frank, taken, I don't know, a few years ago. And Frank is now underneath this rock. You can kind of see the wing peeping out in the bottom, in the center of this. So this rock and this gravel has just fallen over and covered Frank up. Another example, and this is also at Morgan Shoal. This is a playable checkerboard. It was on horizontal. People probably actually played on it, and it's falling into the lake. because the lake is brutal. The lake does not like these things being there. On the other hand, these are brand new carvings near where those other pictures were taken. These were carvings were made just in the last 2 years, because I go there periodically and they weren't there 2 years ago. So there's a bee, a flower, and like a cat face. They're not the best carvings in the world. I mean, you've seen some really accomplished ones, but the fact that anyone's still out there not looking at their phone and doing carvings is, to me, impressive. But Morgan Shoal is threatened. The reason is that it's a mess. You can kind of get a sense. It's just, I mean, it's shattered. The rocks are topsy-turvy. It's really in bad shape. In the current city budget, there is funding for a project that they've been working on for several years to basically add landfill and rebuild the park at Morgan Shoal. Unfortunately, there's no reason to believe that the rebuilding will take account of these carvings. So the likelihood is that most of the carvings, if not all of the carvings there, will be lost. One of the reasons I did the book that I did is to try to bring enough attention that maybe when the Park District and the City Department of Transportation who are running this project really start the project in earnest, they will do something to save some of these rocks, which should be saved for other reasons, which we'll talk about in a minute. We're getting close to the end of the presentation. So Promontory Point is also threatened. So Promontory Point is south of Morgan Shoal, across from the Museum of Science and Industry. It's probably the largest intact WPA era infrastructure project in the city. And the reason it's intact is that in the early 2000s, when the Army Corps of Engineers in the city were going to do the same thing there that they did elsewhere and tear out the limestone blocks and replace them with concrete and steel, the preservation community in Hyde Park got up in arms, organized against it, and got our Senator Barack Obama to basically pull the funding for the Promontory Point project. They did, and the community people did engineering studies to show that you could actually cost effectively preserve the limestone and still provide better accessibility and protection. And they got Promontory Point listed on the National Register of Historic Places, which is a wonderful thing, provides some protection from federal activity, but ultimately it's not landmarked. It doesn't provide any actual prohibition on demolition. So in Biden's infrastructure bill, there is funding to restart the study of Promontory Point and also that La Rabida hospital area. And so the Army Corps is beginning a study to take another look at what should be done, because while this side of Promontory Point is fairly well preserved, the north side of it is in not very good shape, and it definitely needs work. Unfortunately, the city still claims that the locally preferred plan, as they call it, is to tear out the limestone and replace it with concrete and steel. So those community people in Hyde Park are organizing again to try to save Promontory Point, which would, of course, include the carvings, which has not been part of the discussion, although I'm working very hard to get the Promontory Point people, as well as Friends of the Park and other preservation people, to recognize the carvings as part of the issue when it comes to this kind of work. I mean, this is a very delicate, beautiful carving at Promontory Point. There's a fleur-de-lis and then a couple of oak leaves. This is another case where they are slowly fading into oblivion, but the two on the left have, decades more of visibility if they're not torn out and destroyed. Promontory Point, this is just a funny one. It says, "Here Adolph lies," and then underneath says, "and as usual, in Vamp 79th Street." But then on top, it says, "This is Susie's tomb." So that's right on top of that rock. And you can see there's a face at the top and there's some feet at the bottom. More recent carving, I mean, that looks like it has age on it. On the left is dated 1994, sort of an abstract carving. The little thing on the right, and I had to look this up because I was never a fan, that's the logo for Blue Oyster Cult. Other people recognized it instantly, like Mike DeGioia. He knew exactly what it was. A former co-worker. And this is another case where some people are still making art. So over the course of 2018, someone put these mosaics on a rock on the north side of Promontory Point. These just beautiful little mosaics. No, didn't put it. I mean, I think there's a first name on it, but no information about who it is, although I'm still trying to track this artist down. Now, back in the 40s and 50s, Promontory Point was part of a Nike missile defense installation, which is one reason I think there are a lot of bathing beauties on the south western corner of Promontory Point. So this is sort of a Betty Grable type figure. These are odd ones, so it's a pair of bathing beauties back to back, and it looks like they're wearing sun hats. But as an example of the lake's threat, in the last 4 months, since the last time I was out there in November till the next time, which was about 2 weeks ago, these bathing beauties, you can see they're right on the edge of the lake. The Betty Grable figures right to the left. They're now that rock that's sitting in the middle of the lake. So they fell over into the lake and are basically invisible unless you swim up to them. You could probably kind of see them. You know, and it was very disappointing. So behind La Rabida, there are, I mentioned some of the carvings. There's the Peace Rock on the left and this beautiful pair of little hearts on the right. This one is, it's a compass. So it says north, south, east, west. It also has a bunch of names around it. There's a close-up on the compass. And there's the compass, again, falling into the lake. Because these are basically unprotected. And, you know, these have been here for 80, 90 years. When they originally built these, the old ones, they are actually on wooden foundations, which wasn't a problem, except when the lake levels are low and the wood is exposed to air, it starts to rot. And so these foundations can become undermined and these large boulders start falling into the lake. So that's La Rabida. That's also part of the long-term plan for rehabilitation or renovation, but probably means replacement and destruction. If the lake doesn't get them first, then it might. There's a lot of carvings there behind La Rabida, and you know, I don't know how much longer they'll be there. But a lot of carvings were lost. So of the 12 miles of these old limestone revetments, 6 of them were destroyed as part of that Army Corps project. And so like all the carvings on this image, most of them are from Montrose Harbor, and some of them are from around Waveland. These are all gone. These are all disappeared. The only reason we have any images of them is that my colleague Aaron Packer was photographing these in the late 1980s, early 1990s. You know, more examples of carvings that are gone. This you know, carving on the left, which obviously is from the bathing cap, is a very old carving. Also, these are also from from around Montrose Harbor. And then on the right, a 1977 carving of that face. A couple more bathing beauties from that same area. So this is sort of next to Waveland Golf Course, south of Montrose Harbor. You know, the most anatomically correct of all the nudes I found, this was from that same area. This carving was probably about a foot tall. Gives you a sense of scale of some of them. So this was a face, same area in my hand, just, you know, so this was larger than a lot of the carvings. This carving says Bob underneath it, so that's Bob in his beanie. And then I like to call this one the Montrose Giant. This was a very large carving. And you can also see what a mess. So this is south of Montrose Harbor, and you can see, you know, just, you know, the pilings there and the rocks falling into the lake. I mean, definitely a challenge. This is another view of the Montrose Giant. It's another interesting one where someone started carving it, and then it was finished with paint. So someone, maybe the original carver, maybe not, added a hand and sort of gave this figure feet. So very generous, but it's a shame they never finished it. So those are the pictures. So I mentioned the book. I mean, I've been interested in these carvings for a long time. I was interested in them as an example of sort of self-taught vernacular art. I got serious about really looking at them about a dozen years ago. But when I saw that the Army Corps project was destroying them, I started trying to take pictures in earnest. Unfortunately, I was too late, and a lot of the carvings I never saw or took pictures of because I was lazy and didn't get out soon enough. But several years ago, I decided I don't want that to happen again. And the only thing I could think of to try to get some attention was to create a book. So I worked with my friend Aaron Packer, who took a lot of those older pictures. And so we published a book, and I did a fair amount of research, tracked down carvers, as I've talked about, and created Lakefront Anonymous. There are copies here if anyone would like to purchase one. You can also go to my website or go to lakefrontanonymous.com, which is on the next slide, and you can order them online. And you know, I'd be happy to ship out as many as people want. There's most of the pictures you've seen in the presentation are in the book, although not all of them. And then there's a lot more pictures. There's pictures of about 200 odd carvings in the book, as well as again, sort of more details in some of the interviews with the carvers. So that's my pitch for the book, but thank you all. Do we have, yeah. Do we have any Zoom questions? Okay. Any questions in the room here? Yes.
About how deeply are most of those into the rock?
Well, that's a very good question. Like those ones I said were the new ones at Morgan Shoal, those are very shallow. Those are barely scratched in. But like this, thank you. I mean, that's pretty deeply, that's in pretty deep. But you'll see both. You'll see a lot of them are very shallow because these were, and in fact, I showed that Roman Villarreal, who's an experienced veteran stone carver, the hair washers carvings, a picture of that. He said, oh, they didn't do a very good job with that. And I think it's because he felt like they were too shallow. They didn't go deep enough, which means they're gonna wear out sooner. Like those Mayan carvings, those are mostly very shallow, so maybe a quarter to a half inch at most. But some of these go definitely deeper than that. And then but most of them are carved in. There's a few that are, I don't know what the term is, that are actually reliefs where they carved around it rather than carved into the rock, but most of them are carved into the rock. But yeah, it's a good question. I mean, the thing about limestone is a fairly soft rock, which is why, I mean, that's why there was this confluence of events in Chicago that made this possible. It was the fact that you could get to the lake at all, the fact that they lined the lake with limestone, the fact that limestone isn't that hard to carve, but unlike sandstone, it has some toughness to it, so these carvings can survive, even despite the weathering and erosion. A lot of these carvings are almost 100 years old and are still quite visible. So.
What do you think they were carved with?
So, I mean, the people when I've been able to ask, it's usually hammer and chisel, but just hand tools. I don't think anyone was using power tools because they didn't have those kind of power tools when these carvings were being made. I think some people used sharpened like nails, like big heavy duty nails, but I don't show them in here, but a lot of them are just like one or two letters that I think people probably just used a key. And just, you're sitting there, you're hanging out with your friends, you're there for a few hours or several hours every night for a few nights, and, you're just, digging into the rocks. But definitely hand tools. And again, most of these people were not artists or not professional stone carvers. They're just people who felt like, sharing something, expressing something, or leaving behind a little bit of their own identity, or showing their girlfriend or their boyfriend that they cared about them. Or like Guy Lazara, he just said he wanted something to do, and he just thought it would be cool to try to do a portrait. So there you go.
So if you would like to just say thank you for those who are joining us from Zoom, I'll end that.
Okay, well, thank you for those who are joining us from Zoom. I really appreciate your time and attention. And again, besides buying the book, you can go to lakefrontanonymous.com and find out. I have more pictures of the carvings and a little more information about them there. So feel free.